It all started with a group of 4 friends, Mark, Jason, Will, and me, who decided to take a much-needed break from the grind of daily life. We'd been friends since college, sharing countless adventures, but this time we were looking for something different, something that would give us a story to tell for years. We decided to take a road trip along the East Coast, exploring the coastal beauty, sampling local foods, and soaking in the culture. Little did we know, this trip would be the wildest ride of our lives. We kicked things off in New York City, where the concrete jungle swallowed us whole. The energy was electric, and the nights blurred into mornings as we hopped from one dive bar to another, stumbling upon hidden speakeasies and rooftop parties that seemed to appear out of nowhere. We danced with strangers, shared stories with locals, and watched the sun rise over the East River. By the end of our stay, we were all running on fumes, but we had that sense of invincibility that only comes from being in the heart of the city that never sleeps. Our next stop was the Hamptons, where we rented a beach house for a couple of days. It was supposed to be a relaxing pit stop, just us, the ocean, and a cooler full of beers. We spent our days lounging on the beach, catching waves, and our nights around a bonfire, telling stories and laughing until our sides hurt. The highlight of our time there was an impromptu decision to crash a high society party at a nearby mansion. We walked in like we belonged there, mingled with the elite, and somehow managed to avoid getting kicked out. It was the kind of surreal experience that only happens when you're far from home and living in the moment. But the real adventure began when we left the Hamptons and headed south towards the Carolinas. We were on the road, somewhere between Wilmington and Charleston, when the weather started to change. The sky darkened, the wind picked up, and the once gentle rain turned into a torrential downpour. We'd heard rumors of a storm brewing in the Atlantic, but we didn't think much of it. After all, we were young, carefree, and invincible, or so we thought. As we continued driving, the rain became so heavy that it was almost impossible to see the road ahead. The wind howled, pushing against our car with a force that made it difficult to stay on course. The weather reports on the radio grew increasingly alarming, warning of an incoming hurricane. But by then, we were too far from any town or city to find shelter. Panic started to set in as we realized we were driving straight into the storm. We pulled off the highway and found a small, deserted road that led us deep into a dense forest. The plan was to find a safe place to wait out the storm, but the deeper we drove, the more isolated we became. The trees closed in around us, their branches swaying violently in the wind, and the rain beat against the car like 1,000 tiny fists. The road narrowed, and soon we were driving through a tunnel of twisted trees, the headlights barely cutting through the darkness. Then, without warning, the car skidded on the slick road and veered off into the trees. We crashed through the underbrush, the car jerking violently as it hit rocks and roots, before finally coming to a stop in a small clearing. We were shaken but unharmed, though the car was another story. The front bumper was hanging on by a thread, and the tires were nearly buried in mud. We were stuck. The storm raged around us, the wind screaming through the trees like some wild, angry beast. We decided to stay in the car, hoping it would provide some protection, but the fear was palpable. Every gust of wind felt like it could rip the roof off, and the rain was so intense it felt like we were underwater. Jason, usually the calm and collected one, was gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. Mark kept looking out the window, his eyes wide with fear, and Will was muttering something under his breath that I couldn't quite catch. The hours dragged on, each minute feeling like an eternity. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and we were miles away from any help. The isolation, the darkness, the relentless force of nature. It all combined to create a sense of dread that hung heavy in the air. We tried to keep each other's spirits up, but the truth was, we were terrified. We had no idea how long the storm would last or if we'd make it out alive. Then, just as we thought things couldn't get any worse, we heard it. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from deep within the forest. At first, we thought it was thunder, but it was too consistent, too menacing. It grew louder, closer, until it felt like it was right on top of us. The car shook, the windows rattling as the growl turned into a roar, and suddenly, the ground beneath us gave way. The car lurched forward, sliding down what felt like a steep incline, and we all screamed as we were thrown around inside. The car rolled, the world outside spinning in a blur of rain and darkness, until we crashed to a stop at the bottom of a ravine. The silence that followed was deafening. The only sound was the pounding of the rain and our ragged breaths. We were alive, but barely. We climbed out of the wrecked car, drenched to the bone and covered in mud. The storm had driven us deep into the forest, and there was no way we could get the car out of the ravine. We were on foot, miles from civilization, with no shelter and no way to contact anyone. The fear that had been simmering beneath the surface now boiled over. We were stranded, and the storm was far from over. We decided to follow the ravine, hoping it would lead us to a river or a road. The rain was relentless, turning the ground beneath our feet into a slippery mess. The wind whipped through the trees, and every so often, we heard that growling roar again, echoing through the forest like a warning. It wasn't until later that we realized it was the sound of the storm funneling through the ravine, a natural amplifier for the hurricane's fury. Hours passed as we trudged through the forest, soaked and shivering, our nerves frayed. Every shadow seemed to hold some hidden threat, every noise a sign of danger. We were exhausted, but the adrenaline kept us moving, pushing us forward through the night. At one point, we stumbled upon an old, abandoned cabin, barely standing against the storm. It was a wreck, but it was shelter, and we collapsed inside, grateful for even the flimsiest protection from the elements. But the cabin was more of a curse than a blessing. As we huddled inside, the storm intensified, and we could hear the creaking of the walls as the wind battered against it. Water seeped through the roof, pooling on the floor, and the cold was bone-chilling. We huddled together for warmth, but there was a tension in the air, an unspoken fear that we might not make it through the night. The night was endless. The storm howled, the cabin groaned under the pressure, and the cold seeped into our bones. We tried to keep each other awake, but exhaustion was catching up to us. Mark, ever the optimist, kept trying to make jokes, but even he couldn't mask the fear in his voice. Jason, usually the rational one, was losing his cool, pacing back and forth, muttering to himself. And Will, the tough guy of the group, was visibly shaking, his bravado crumbling in the face of nature's wrath. As dawn finally broke, the storm began to subside. The rain lessened, the wind died down, and the forest was eerily silent. We emerged from the cabin, stiff and sore, to find the world around us transformed. Trees had been uprooted, the ground was littered with debris, and the air was thick with the smell of wet earth and shattered wood. But we were alive, and that was all that mattered. We managed to find a path that led us out of the forest and onto a road, where we were eventually picked up by a passing truck. The driver, a grizzled old man who had seen his share of storms, took one look at us and shook his head. "You boys are lucky to be alive," he said, and we knew he was right. The trip back home was a blur. We were battered, bruised, and utterly exhausted, but we were alive. We had faced the fury of nature and survived, but it was an experience that left us all changed. The invincibility we once felt was gone, replaced by a newfound respect for the forces beyond our control. And as we sat in silence, driving away from the coast, we couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude for the friends who stuck by us, for the strangers who helped us, and for the simple fact that we had lived to tell the tale. But there was also a lingering unease, a sense that we had come too close to the edge, that we had looked into the abyss and seen something dark and terrifying staring back. This wasn't just another adventure. This was the story that would haunt our dreams, the tale we would tell around campfires, each time with a little more detail, a little more fear, and a lot more respect for the power of the unknown. That's all for today. Subscribe so you don't miss out on the next story.